Good morning, I'm Tom at Sweet Maria's Coffee, and I'm going to talk today about evenness of roasts. That means the surface appearance of coffee that you roast. You have one batch that bean to bean has a very even brown color, and you have a batch where you have a lot of variation in the surface color of the coffee. Specifically, I'm going to address natural coffee. What I've done is roasted 4 batches here in different roasters of the same natural dry process coffee. So this all started because yesterday we had a kind of spontaneous conversation downstairs because Chris had roasted a coffee. It's our Ethiopian Aillio Bullet natural dry process coffee in the Bullet roaster and got this very even surface appearance. And Erik had roasted the same coffee in the FreshRoast SR800, kind of a faster air roast, and had gotten a very uneven appearance. And we tasted the 2 coffees and they were certainly different, but the questions came up like, is it the roaster, is it the coffee? Why the same coffee could produce 2 different appearances? And so I wanted to break apart this, pull apart this issue of the appearance of natural coffees that you might roast. But it's quite complicated when I do so, and I don't really have all the answers to this, I have to admit. A lot of what you observe is kind of anecdotal. But after 30 years of roasting, you have some observations from it. So let's sort of take this apart. And the first thing that I'm going to have to set aside is the level of roast. So if you roast coffee darker, it just tends to develop into a more even dark brown color. And you'll have a more pleasing, even appearance. Maybe some oils will migrate to the surface. And even some of the coffee that would not color brown in the lighter roast will kind of brown as it gets to the really dark levels. So I have to kind of set that aside as an issue because these are all the same roast level, more or less, and they're all sort of city level roast, medium roast. I checked that roast color really with the ground coffee sample that I set up and put next to each other. So I don't really look at the variability of the surface appearance from bean to bean in the roast to do that. So that's the first thing to set aside. The second thing is the coffee, and the third is the roaster. So in this case, we're talking about natural coffees because these tend to be the ones that don't roast to such an even surface appearance. Now, what's that about? Well, as far as coffee from the tree, when it's harvested, it's impossible to pick only the red coffee cherries. You're going to get some that are partially ripe with green, more near the stem and red on the tip, and you're going to get some that are fully green. They're just going to come off as you selectively pick. Now, super uneven roasts are something that traditionally has belonged to commercial coffees and to low-grade coffees. For example, in naturals, there was a designation, Gesha, grade 5 natural. And those coffees, just the labor that went into them is a lot different than high-end sort of specialty coffee. Gesha grade 5 would tend to be picked more indiscriminately. The coffee comes into the drying station or is laid out in the farmer's home or backyard. And there really isn't hand selection. Specialty coffee, there's rigorous hand selection. The beds are laid out and they're gone over time and time again to remove the green coffee cherry. Now, the fully green unripe coffee cherry is what results in what we call a Quaker in the cup. A Quaker is a bean that just resists roasting. Which is not really a true term. It resists turning brown. And then you have semi-Quakers, which are sort of those partially ripe coffees. Those can result in a more tan color from experience observing it. And then you have the ripe cherries, which should brown normally. What's that about? So unripe coffee cherry, green coffee cherry that has not fully developed as a seed and a fruit, doesn't have the same chemical compounds that are precursors to the browning reaction that happens during roasting, the Maillard reaction. So they simply don't have the material in them to turn brown. And so that's why they appear not to roast. They do roast, they just don't brown like ripe coffee cherry. And in those old school dry process, you would see a lot of that. So the fact is though, even in some really high-end natural coffees, you're going to still see an occasional Quaker and semi-Quaker because it's incredibly hard to find those, especially once the coffee's been on the bed for, let's say, a week and it starts to go from red to brown. They're harder to distinguish. That's why a lot of stations we work with are very focused on getting the green coffee, the brightest green coffee, out immediately before it turns brown, and you can't tell it apart as well. So one of the main things that's come up as I try to take this small conversation we had downstairs and turn it into something meaningful and fairly thorough is that we're talking not about even roast, we're talking about even roast color. And I've already suggested that, right? But even roast color is not even roast. And I just want to show you this because here is, on the bottom row, is the FreshRoast, a range. And what I've done is I've chosen about 4 beans here, up to about here, 5, let's call it, that represent the range of the roast, which is, I don't know if this will work, but this is the roast, okay? And on the top row is the bullet, and this is the roast. And that worked. Okay. So these represent a sort of well-browned coffee, visually even roasted coffee within a certain range. And then we get into these things that visibly you would call Quaker, semi-Quaker. And it's hard because on the phone camera, I can tell you that in person, these really are marginally semi-Quaker. But what my experience has been, and it's been heightened by this test, is that things here that would start to look like a Quaker, let's say here and here, this, when I do my little impromptu taste test, this is quite a nice sweet coffee. Then we start to get into some popcorn type flavors here, definitely Quaker. This bean looks like it has another problem, but absolutely a Quaker, totally a Quaker, 100% gonna be a peanut type Quaker, probably popcorn Quaker. Don't know about that one, let's skip that one. So the strange experience here, and I know this is not great science in any way, but it's just purely anecdotal, is that I'm actually getting those peanut flavors from beans like this and popcorn flavors in beans like this, even though they are in a different sort of range of brownness that over here would be, quite par for the course with ripe coffee. So, sorry, this is Ethiopian wet process. This is Ethiopian dry process. And you see the color of the remaining silver skin, which comes off the bean as chaff, as the chaff component. And you see how different they are. And this is something that really changes our perception of evenness and also of roast level. Another thing that really influences our perception of evenness is silver skin itself. So these are instances where in roasting, just depending on the roaster, you'll get a lot of silver skin removal from the way the beans are agitated. All of these, as you can see, have remaining silver skin, which is a continuity with the silver skin that's in the fold. The silver skin that's in the fold doesn't like to come off. The silver skin that's on the outside usually comes off. In this case, it doesn't, and all of these were pulled from air roasts. The drum roaster had pretty much 100%. I couldn't find an example. Let me see. Here's one right here. Little piece there. Now, let me do, of course, another exaggerated test. Don't look at my hands, I was just doing plumbing. We had a pipe burst while we were cleaning and we broke a pipe, believe it or not. So what you can see here, and I'm just putting these beans back, is quite well roasted coffee under something that visibly looked very uneven. So the other issue, just to be clear on this, is that silver skin on naturals tends to darken. And I think that's probably a lot be about the fermentation, the contact time with the mucilage inside the cherry as it dries, and it stains white. It stains dark, or colors visibly darker. But that silver skin is still there. I can see it. And the white silver skin is much more visually apparent. So all this talk about visible evenness of roast leads us back to the green coffee. And as you can see, this is what we typically think of as actual green coffee. That's a Colombia wet process. And this is the coffee we're talking about, this Ethiopian natural. So they tend to look more yellow. This tends to be from the fact that there's more silver skin on the coffee seed, and that the silver skin has a yellow hue to it, probably from a long contact time, fermentation time inside the cherry. Yes, natural coffee is fermented. It's not fermented in a tank, it's fermented in the fruit, but the same mechanisms of fermentation are occurring. And the other thing that's unique about this in the big picture is that coffee is this agricultural product, and it's variable, and it comes from the tree, and then through the process of selection of the cherry on the tree, selection by machines in a wet mill, or hand selection on a drying bed in the case of naturals, we are essentially homogenizing the coffee. We're homogenizing it with the goal of finding the ripe fruit and the dense seed and the mature fruit, and that's the coffee that goes into specialty coffee. The naturals, by their nature and by the lack of mechanism in the processing, are going to be more heterogeneous. They're going to have more variation. And so in some ways, the variation we see in the roast color does go back to what natural coffee is about. So I think generally in the consumer side or the coffee roasting side, the importer side, we think of coffee a little more mechanically. We think of, 22-second shots on an espresso machine and, 12-minute and 35-second roasts. And in a way, the agriculture side of coffee doesn't conform to those kind of mechanistic ideas of something quantifiable by numbers. So this is the coffee, and I just pulled out, not even trying, a variety of coffee beans, some borderline defect, some really not defective at all, and all of these are going to be contributing something different to the cup. And of course, that cup, based on the 45 beans that may go into making that single cup, is going to vary. And what you notice here is this incredible range of size, these kind of longberry type varieties. Some of these are selections in Ethiopia, some of them are kind of mother tree heirloom coffees. Right here, I got excited because I thought I'd found a visible Quaker, what will become a Quaker, an immature seed. In a natural coffee, it would look green, but not like a green washed coffee. It would, like this. Oops, sorry. There's one of our Colombias. It has a kind of metallic silver skin that clings to the surface, but this kind of disappointed me, and now I don't think it actually is a Quaker. But that's a sign of a Quaker, and that's so hard to spot just visibly, let alone by a machine, that it's very hard to color sort Quakers out of coffee. Sometimes it can be done by density, but a lot of times Quakers are actually quite dense beans. It's a pea berry. This is a little bit shriveled. And here we have coffee, here, and here, where you have a lot of a silver skin attached that's quite stained by, I guess, the fermentation is my best guess. And these used to be called foxy beans. That's not a joke. They were colored, and they were considered a partial defect. And yet it's really just, exterior surface color. I did think that one of these might be what you call a sour. Now, sour was where the coffees actually had a kind of secondary long fermentation. And that used to be considered a defect too, up until quite recently. And in some camps it still is. But now with, anaerobic coffees, which aren't really anaerobic, but that's another thing, people are actually trying to create sours. And that's legitimized. There's sour beers, and that's a flavor some people really like, is these intense, fruity, kind of acetic vinegar sourness in some coffees. So these may qualify as sours, but I can't really see the coffee underneath to judge that, underneath the silver skin. Okay, so let's add in the complicating factor of what type of roaster you're roasting your natural coffee with, your dry process coffee. So yes, my experience generally is that a drum roaster of various kinds will roast to a more even surface appearance. Drum roasts tend to be longer roasts. Air roasts tend to be faster roasts. They roast because of the hot air stream. They tend to do some different things with coffee visually. They tend to puff it more, enlarge it more. And yes, I think you generally will see more variation from bean to bean in the surface color of coffee. Now, I think this is a false comparison in a way, because air roast and drum roast aren't really two clear categories. There's all kinds of things in between. And what one air roaster is doing versus another, let's say a fully fluidized bed air roaster like a Civets, or some of the home roasters, some of the poppers, versus one that's a cyclonic action swirling coffee around. Those are two really different things. And with drum roasters, you have a very old style, more conduction heat system with a cast metal drum, like an old Probat. It depends on how your airflow and your drum speed is set up. And then you have hybrids like the Loring. Is that a drum roaster or an air roaster? It's kind of both. On the home roasting side, you have the Gene Cafe that roasts in a drum through a hot air stream. So there's not really a clear category in between one and the other. But have observed more surface appearance from the longer roasts that are in drum roasters versus faster air roasts. So the next thing is, what does that mean? Does that mean a coffee is good or bad? So here I have my comparison of the roast levels from the ground coffee, which is more accurate than really looking at the surface of whole bean coffee. And then I have my cup. And so the most important thing here that I learned a long time ago from an old coffee trader is don't cup with your eyes, cup with your taste buds. And that's really true. It's not about what coffee looks like. It's about what it tastes like. Now, it doesn't mean it means nothing that if a coffee looks really weird or uneven in the roast that you're not going to taste something. There's some evidence there about some issue. But you should really go primarily by the cup flavor. So let's taste these coffees and see. So I actually already went through these when they were a little bit hotter, and I'm only producing 1 cup each, which isn't really protocol. There is a lot of clarity and sweetness in this roast. One thing that may be true is that the person who roasted this, which wasn't me, might have actually hand-picked out some of the light Quaker beans. Now, with home roasting, that's always an option. Home roasters have this great advantage of being able to sort of upgrade and improve their roasts that a commercial roaster, if you're roasting a whole bag of coffee at a time, is very difficult to do. Some people have looked into color sorting machines after roasting to improve the quality of coffee, which is a mixed bag. Shouldn't you, pay for better coffee with money that goes then to the producer side in order to get the cup you want, versus use tech to improve your coffee? Potentially, you could then buy lower quality coffee and upgrade it for your use. Yeah, I'm a little on the fence about that. But home roasting, picking out a few Quaker beans is really easy. But one of the things to really distinguish is which coffee here is influencing the cup. And that's not so clear. I use a test that is proven in time. I just eat the coffee. So I find a truly light Quaker coffee bean like this one. And don't choke because it's easy. That shockingly was not that bad of a coffee. It has a sweet fruitiness. It's a bit honeyed. This one definitely has the popcorn kernel flavor. You know, you eat one of those unpopped popcorn kernels. That would distract in the cup, but it's not really the super astringent, dry, like peanut skins, nut skin flavor. So that's very interesting. Now on this end of the spectrum where we get a more even roast, that didn't appear to be a full-on Quaker, but it is kind of popcorn-like, the popcorn kernel-like. That one just has a kind of a dry, bready flavor. So I know that you're probably going to be laughing at this great scientific method of eating a coffee cherry, eating a coffee bean. But, you know, a lot of knowledge in coffee happens anecdotally like this. You observe something and you check it and you find out. And that also leads you to question things like, does an even roast taste better than a roast with more variation in the surface color? There's also this interesting thing is that when you travel and you visit coffee washing stations and farms, you always want to encourage good, even picking of coffee. The fact is there's been some experiments in 100% ripe coffee cherry harvesting, like pure red, exactly the same color. The result at times, you don't want to tell all your producers this, is that cup has been flatter and less dynamic and interesting, especially in terms of the range in sweetness and acidity, than coffee with some variation in the ripeness of the fruit. Again, it's an anecdotal experience, but you tend to flatten out the flavor when you get too much uniformity in coffee, in my experience. So should all coffee cherry look uniformly ripe? I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, just based on my experience. So in tasting these coffees, I do get great clarity and sweetness from the Bullet roast, but I feel it suffers a little in terms of dynamic acidity. But I do like this cup a lot. In the fresh roast, it's actually surprising that this cup does not taste that Quakery. It has a lot of sweetness, has a lot of fruit and sort of dynamic range. There's a little bit of a dry biscuitiness, but it's in no way astringent. And that's a little surprising. So this is a test that just came out of a conversation we had downstairs. And we thought, well, people would like to understand, should I be looking for even roasts? Is an even roast a good roast? Why do my naturals not roast as evenly as some of the wet processed coffees I buy? Is there a problem with that? And ultimately, it's going to be up to you to taste the coffees and ask yourself whether you like them or not, or whether there is a roast issue or a coffee quality issue to figure out. But one thing is, if you do have light coffee beans, taste them, find out what they're contributing to the cup. And what we like to do is, if we see a roast of like 100 grams with a lot of light coffee, we'll cull out all of the light beans and we'll create a cup where it's loaded with the light colored coffee versus one that's darker, and then one that's unsorted. And we'll taste the three of them and we'll find out what is this contributing to the cup. And the results are oftentimes surprising to us. So we have another illustration for you about naturals, and that pretty good lots of natural can have Quakers. This one's a little bit surprising. I was just roasting for fun some Cup of Excellence samples. So this is Brazil, number 5, Gesha, 90.41 points, 1310 meters, Sul de Minas. Here's the green coffee, Gesha Natural, Brazil Cup of Excellence. So, you know, a lot of people agreed that this was a fantastic cup of coffee, over 90 points. And yet, I'm roasting it on the ProVap. Did a pretty nice roast. Oops, here's one more. excuse me. And this is what I have, just, you know, estimation of what I think are full Quakers and semi-Quakers from this roast. And things like this are absolutely full on Quaker. And like, I'll do my test. I will taste these and I'll see how strong the astringency, whether it's towards peanut and peanut shell, that's the real strong one, in my opinion, versus popcorn, versus something that's just like kind of biscuity, but actually sweet and contributes something nice to the cup. So I'll check these out. Oh, dang. Well, I said that was one of my definite 2 full Quakers. Very, very Quakery. Very astringent. Wow. Let me take a semi-Quaker. Popcorn. Like the unpopped popcorn kernel. So I know this is pretty laughable to me, eating coffee and tasting, but I don't know another way to isolate a single defect, one complete unit, one bean of defect, and get some sensory perception of how strong it is. What that contributes to the cup, how much it's distracting, I don't know, 90.41 points. So I don't know if somebody called these out before. I don't think they're allowed to do that in Cup of Excellence, but wow, that was a really strong Quaker.